So, a lot of people really want a proper cinema camera, but they have to stay on a budget. The Panasonic line of cameras are considered budget powerhouses. The entire lineup of cameras is based around giving you a lot at a budget price. But Panasonic tends to cut a lot of corners and things rarely work as expected. So let's do a deep dive and find out if the Panasonic G85 is the budget cinema camera of your dreams, is it worth your money, and how does it stack up to the Canon M50, its closest competitors? Let's dive right in. By the way guys, if you're new to the channel, we talk about anything and everything to do with cameras, from entry level to high-end professional gear, plus filmmaking techniques to take your work to the next level. As always, there's a link down below to all the products we talk about, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for all our future content. Let's get into the video. So the first thing I'm really curious about is whether or not this camera actually looks good and has a beautiful image. Because sometimes specs can be pretty misleading. It might look good on paper, but really the camera's trash. But for the spec nerds out there like myself, this camera has a 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor that is actually the smallest sensor type you can get in a DSLR camera. And the sensor size and the Panasonic mount has both negatives and positives, but I'll talk more about that later in the review. Let's quickly touch upon photos. The photos is really not what this camera is made for. It can do photos decently well, but I really wouldn't recommend picking this camera up if you're trying to do photos, especially because of the small sensor size. This camera does a whopping 10 frames per second in single focus mode and goes down to 6 frames per second in tracking and continuous autofocus, which isn't terrible, but it's not that impressive either. Personally, if you're looking to do photos at this price point, you're better off with something like the Sony a6000, which does 10 frames per second in continuous autofocus and has a bigger sensor. However, that's not the full story. This camera does have an electronic shutter mode in which it does 40 frames per second with a slight crop. Electronic shutter has its own downsides like rolling shutter and strobing, but in a pinch and you really need to shoot something fast in photo, it's a nice feature to have. But video is really where this camera shines, so let's take a deeper dive into the video of this camera and how does it stack up to the Canon M50. So first things first, this camera does do 4K at 23 frames per second and 30 frames per second with basically a non-noticeable crop, which is a big deal because the Canon M50, its closest competitor, also does 4K, but the Canon M50 crops down its sensor. Now, when you crop into the Canon M50, you're probably cropping down to something that's similar to the size of the Panasonic G85, so your field of view is about the same. So if you're looking to shoot cinematic work in 4K or just 4K in general at this price point, the Panasonic G85 is actually a really good deal and saves you a ton of headache because it doesn't do that crop in. Apart from that, it does full HD at 23, 30, and 60 frames per second, which is pretty standard and nothing really to write home about. I would have been really impressed to have super slow motion with 120 frames per second on the G85, which the Canon M50 does have, although the Canon M50 does 120 at 720p mode. However, there's one thing that most people will not tell you about this camera and you will not see on the spec sheet. When shooting full HD with this camera, at full HD 60 frames per second, it shoots 28 megabits per second. In 4K, it only does 100 megabits per second. To give you comparison, the Canon M50 does 60 megabits per second in full HD at 60 frames per second, and it does 120 megabits per second in 4K. And 20 megabits per second in 4K may not seem like a lot, but it definitely makes a difference. And in HD, the Canon delivers almost double the data rate. And based on that, it would look like that it falls behind the competition, but that is still not the full story. The G85 actually has two log modes built right in, Cinelike D and Cinelike V, which are specifically made for professional color grading. So despite the low bitrate, you're actually getting a professional level color profile that's going to help you make this camera look better than the Canon M50. The Canon M50 in camera has beautiful colors, like Canon color science, you just cannot fight them. But the Panasonic G85 right in camera in standard mode looks pretty bad. Panasonic colors are kind of ugly in my opinion. Don't fight me, don't hate me if you like Panasonic. Just in camera, compared to the Canons especially, they're not very good. But when you shoot in Cinelike V, Cinelike D, you have so much more latitude in that profile that you can actually make these colors look better, if not as good, as the Canon colors. It's interesting, but this is a camera where you're almost forced to shoot in the cinema profile because standard mode just doesn't look that good. However, there's more to this camera than meets the eyes, because there's more to this camera than just the sensor. This camera has some really unique and interesting features that I think almost anybody would find useful. One of the features that I love about this camera is actually called 4K live cropping. You can take your full 4K frame and actually make a 1080p window within that frame, and your camera will automatically, in camera with software, pan from window to window or track from window to window, and you can actually do digital zoom ins, digital pans, digital up and downs with this camera, all in camera. It's kind of bananas. I've never seen a camera do this, but it's super useful, especially if you're a product photographer or you lack a slider or a stabilizer. It's really easy to get interesting movement right in camera. Next, let's talk about autofocus and digital in-body stabilization. So autofocus is not really a place where this camera shines. When compared to the Canon M50, this camera does not hold a candle to dual pixel autofocus. Dual pixel autofocus is killing it right now. It does an okay job in single focus mode, but as soon as things start moving in and out of frame, or you start tracking objects, it gets a little wonky, the autofocus starts to hunt, and it just doesn't look very professional. However, I think this camera is made for cinematic DP and people that are working with ACs. So in that realm of shooting, using autofocus is like the ultimate sign of shame. You probably wouldn't even tell someone if you used autofocus. For that reason, I don't think cinematic DPs, which this camera is aimed at, will really care about the mediocre autofocus. Next, let's talk about IBIS, because the IBIS in this camera is pretty amazing. This camera actually has 3 different types of stabilization. You have the actual in-body stabilization that is on the sensor, keeping the sensor stable. Mind you, in handheld mode, it does kind of give you a floaty feel, but that's pretty standard for that type of stabilization. Next, it has stabilization built right into the sensor, which actually works in tandem with the IBIS, so you don't get this weird jerky effect. A lot of cameras that have stabilization in the sensor and in the lens tend to fight each other, but Panasonic has figured out a way to make the two work together. Lastly, it has something called e-stabilization, which is electronic stabilization. It crops into your image just slightly, but then electronically stabilizes it, kind of like what Premiere Pro does with Warp Stabilizer, all in camera. I ended up using the standard 12 to 60mm kit lens, and that kit lens, along with the actual camera body electronic stabilization, gave me amazing results. I was kind of worried that it was going to fight my gimbal, but I did some test shoots with this camera on my Weebill S3, and I have to say, the results are amazing. This camera looks so smooth, so cinematic. I was blown away by how good this camera looks, simply in terms of cinematic movement. And lastly, let's talk about design, because the design of this camera is actually one of the most exciting aspects of this camera. This camera looks and is built like a proper video DSLR, like an A7 III or something from the EOS R series. The body is well built, bulky, robust, and best of all, it's weather sealed. You can literally put this camera through anything. And I love the button layout and ergonomics of this camera. It has five customizable function buttons. That is really on par with a proper high-end video DSLR. And the 2 things that I love about this camera is 1, the vari-angle tilt screen. You're gonna be able to get lots of interesting angles with that vari-angle tilt screen, especially if this is your first camera and you just don't have enough money for a proper monitor. This is gonna get the job done until then, and it has an audio jack for external audio. However, it doesn't have a headphone jack, which is really disappointing to see, but at this price point, I'm really not that concerned. And next, let's talk about the small sensor and the Panasonic mount. Remember when I said it has positives and negatives? We've talked about the negatives, such as the bad low light, the small sensor size, the lack of resolution, but let's talk about the positives. The biggest positive, because of the Panasonic mount and the small sensor size, is that you have so many options when it comes to affordable lenses. Even the mid-range Panasonic lenses for this camera are pretty affordable, and you will pretty much never have an issue with getting good lenses for this camera. And because of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K camera, which also has a Micro Four Thirds sensor, there's been a huge boom of companies making high-end cinema glass specifically for Micro Four Thirds sensors. Okay. Enough nerding out. Should you buy this camera, and how does this camera stack up to the Canon M50? Alright, so if you're a cinematic DP, or someone that's almost always color correcting and adjusting their image in post, and you need your camera to have a robust, solidly built body that's going to hold up on a professional or semi-professional film set, this camera is a great deal. But if you're not a DP, a cinematographer, or an artist, but you're really someone that's using this camera as a way to just communicate like a vlogger, someone that's maybe doing educational content like this, and you're really not trying to color grade every single video you make, do not buy this camera. The autofocus is not there for you. You're gonna need autofocus. The stabilization looks really good, but a lot of you guys don't need that much stabilization with vlogging or just keeping your camera on a tripod. Stabilization is really gonna help the DPs and the cinematic filmmakers. You guys should really pick up the Canon M50. Well guys, that's pretty much it for the Panasonic G85 review. If you're still watching this video, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for all my future content. And if you guys have any questions about these cameras whatsoever, hit me up in the comments down below. And while you're in the comments, let me know, would you get a Panasonic or a Canon camera? I'm always curious as to what kind of cameras you guys are vibing with. Last but not least, I'm leaving links down below to all of the gear we talked about today. So if you want to pick anything up, make sure to check out those links. That's pretty much it. See you guys in the next video.